OK, bonjour, bienvenue tout le monde. Donc, vous avez assisté à notre conversation, ça a l'air. Donc, je vous présente Rohan Shanbhag. Il est de TELUS. Il va nous présenter Red Team Result to Tangible Risk Management. Et je lui laisse la parole. It's to you, Rohan. Can start.
All right. Thank you so much, Dia, for that introduction. So thank you all for taking the time to come and check this out. I know it's a busy day. I know there's a lot of interesting things going on, so I do appreciate you guys taking the time. So just a little quick introduction. As Steve said, I'm essentially a security consultant at TELUS, and I've been in the cybersecurity business for like over 3 years. I've been in IT over 5 years. And I've essentially done a whole bunch of things. Like I've done web deployments, I've done risk assessments, risk management, I've done actual hands-on coding. So I've had a fair wide range. And risk management is something that I've been involved in for essentially the whole 5 years. So I've seen a full spectrum, right? And I started my dipping my feet into like the sort of pen test world and having to deal with pen testers when I first started with my previous employer. And they were one of the big four firms. And one of my first engagements was essentially working with pen testers to write their reports. For whatever reason, pen testers don't make great writers. And so they would go through, they're fantastic, bright individuals. They would go in, they'd do their job. They'd get these results, they'd put it in a report, and of course my partner at the time was like, well, we cannot put this in front of the client because this looks horrible. They found great stuff, but it's just the nature in which they would present it left something to be desired. And this takes me to Red Team Results in Tangible Risk Management, right? So essentially, the basics of all risk management is threat times vulnerability, and the intersection of that is risk. Now, this is a pretty basic concept. If you've done CISSP, if you've done literally any sort of like high-level certification, this is the foundational of all risk management. Sort of comes down to threat and vulnerability, and there being a risk. No threat, no risk. No vulnerability, no risk. Right. So as a pen tester or a red team person, you are the threat. Right. So for you, the minute you find the vulnerability, boom, you have identified a risk. So for you, that's something that goes into your report right away because you, as a threat actor, you were able to exploit a vulnerability. Therefore, you notice a risk. However, there's a little more to this, right? And this is something where things start to get a little more complicated, and we don't like complicated. So let me explain a little bit more. What do I mean by that? The degree of this risk, whether it's greater or lower, really depends on some other factors, right? So you found a threat, you exploited a vulnerability, but the level of that risk really varies based on likelihood, exposure, and business impact. Now, obviously, likelihood is the rate of occurrence, exposure is what is your exposure factor, and business impact is something that the business should have already done, if not you doing it for them. So why do I mention this? Of course, this is the red team strength, right? Like as I mentioned before, I worked with pen testers, and they sort of go through this exercise. They have a tight deadline. They have a lot of work to do, so they quickly go in, threat, they find the vulnerability, they highlight the risk, and they move on. So essentially, what I'm saying is that the degree of the risk is not something that is considered, and that I would say is a red team weakness. And there are a variety of reasons why that would be the case. Well, the first one and the most cynical one is not my job syndrome, right? Like, you're hired, you're on a tight deadline, you have 2 weeks to do the test and write a report and move on to the next one. Because, I know how busy pen testing schedules and red team schedules are. So the first instinct is, to determine a degree of risk, I found a vulnerability, I exploited it, we were able to get domain admin. The degree of the risk is honestly high. It's not my job to go in there and do it. That's a very cynical way. And sometimes, you're just context unaware. You don't necessarily know the scope of your client. You don't necessarily know if it's a lobster fishing company or if it's a large bank. I know that's a bit of a stretch. I mean, you do know who your pen test, but like essentially you have a range of IPs, you have a scope, and you're going at it. Right. So, and then third is of course just a knowledge gap. A lot of them may be younger, maybe don't necessarily have a full contextual awareness of risk management, not something that they're interested in. Fair enough. So how does that actually apply in practice, right? So this is a scenario, and it's a little bit of make believe, but I'm of course using the MITRE ATT&CK framework because it's something that's very easy to recognize. Assume you're called in to do a pen test operation, right? And you do some reconnaissance work, you gather their information, you search some technical, you get some information. Ultimately, it's totally fine in this particular pen test, hypothetical pen test scope for you to send a target from that organization, from your research, a phishing email. And maybe that person is sort of like a mid-level admin on some of the systems that they have. And you get them to execute a malware, and you sort of get access, and you're now in, right? And then you do some account manipulation. You're able to do you're able to create some accounts. You're able to move on, and then you start doing your little lateral movement, right? You maybe create some valid accounts, and then you notice, there's nothing stopping me from me being able to elevate the privileges. And after that, you start doing a little more pivoting. You find out there's a network share, there's a cloud service. Do some further pivoting. You do some internal spear phishing, maybe you exploit some remote services. I know this is a very shitty organization if they've not caught you so far, but that's obviously play along. Suspension of disbelief is highly encouraged. And then to prove that you've done all these things, you do some screen captures, you do some automated collection. Maybe you're able to gather some screenshots of network data, say, yeah, this is your systems are bad, and maybe as a final act, you sort of transfer data to a cloud service just to prove that yes, you indeed were able to successfully do it. And essentially, you're saying that you were able to get the impact done. Like you're in total control, and you get to that point. Now, when you're at this point and you're done with the test, and you're asked to present a report to management, and this is my personal experience, right? I mean, I'm not saying everybody does it this way, but in my personal experience, when you put the report down, this is what you see. You're like, oh, high risk. I was able to find all this information online. Phishing email was not blocked. The user downloaded malware. I was able to find everything on the network. Like no one stopped me. I was able to transfer data outside. And then you put together some recommendations. And you say, filtering service is required for emails, user awareness training for execution, application configuration and user monitoring for persistent escalation, and so on and so forth, NetFlow, and of course DLP, which is pretty high up there. And you take a look at this and, you submit your findings. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. It's high risk. You're able to abuse elevation control in escalation, or data and network sharing. You're able to transfer to a cloud account, for God's sake. It's a very high risk. That's the nature of your approach. What you've not done here is you've not considered likelihood, exposure, or business impact. Now, why does that matter? So we're anecdotal, right? We like to learn via stories. So take let's walk through this example. Say you're called in to do a physical assessment of a nuclear weapons code management facility, right? It's a very nondescript building. This is not a real building, obviously. This is a stock image. You find a public listing, sort of able to walk up to the facility, be able to enter via unsecured back door, well, this shitty nuclear facility, and then you move through undetected inside the facility. No one's stopping you. You have unchallenged entry into the final code room, and at that point, you take a couple of photos to prove that you were there, that you were able to see them, and then you leave via the back door, right? So when the time comes to present your recommendations, you do something like this. You tell them, well, delist the location, build an 8-foot high fence with barbed wire, you reinforce the door with biometrics, the door came in, add cameras in the corridors, in the rooms, use smart card and biometric lock, that's pretty, and no photography allowed inside. And then have an entry-exit checkpoint to check, who's coming in, who's going out. And this is pretty normal, right? You present this to the facility manager, who is blissfully unaware of all these risks, and everyone congratulates you, the job well done, they put money aside and they do it. The next time, you're called to do an assessment for a large suburban house. You do the same thing. You find where it is, you walk up, you enter, you move undetected through the whole house. It's a largish house, maybe it has 4 or 5 rooms. You finally get unchallenged entry into the room with a safe. I mean, it is a house. It doesn't have anything more than, I guess, the most secure thing in the house is a safe. You're able to crack that safe open, take a photo of what's in the safe to show, you were there, and then you leave via the back door. And then the husband or wife asks, well, okay, now what are your recommendations? And then you essentially say the same thing. You're like, 8-foot high fence with barbed wire, have a reinforced door with biometrics, put security cameras between, your bathroom and kitchen, and then you sort of go through this whole process. I mean, obviously, that when asked to justify, it's a little ridiculous, right? Like, I mean, you wouldn't have a suburban house with an 8-foot high fence unless there's bin Laden inside. So, so it's a bit outlandish for you to make such suggestions, and you wouldn't, and you would be laughed out if you did it. So then, why would you do it in an organization that's a small to medium enterprise? And essentially, this is an exercise where it's an analogy, obviously. So you can replace some of those things with like delisting is limiting public information, fence is the firewall, like net flow monitoring is cameras, So you get the idea. So where does that lead me, essentially? And this is the core of the thought. This is the core frustration that I've had to deal with, and sort of like this has been put together over several years, right? So again, we go back to our example, and you take a look at that fact that was executed, and if you take a look at likelihood, exposure, and business impact, and you consider the scale of the organization, I would argue, and this is just my personal opinion, obviously, what I would say is that the real high risk is the point of entry, the place where you're able to, the back door, the proverbial back door that you use to gain initial access is the only point of high risk. Because if you take that away, then you're not able to do any of the persistence, escalation, discovery, all the way through to impact. So giving the recommendation of filtering service and user awareness is correct in that instance. However, for the others, I would say you have to recalculate. Now, yes, in this particular scenario, the assumption is that you will spend more time with the client and to understand their likelihood, exposure, and business impact. And as red teams, this will be a little bit of skill development. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, not everybody likes to do it, but in order to give realistic recommendations and suggestions for your act, and to in fact deliver value to the client. Now imagine if you are a lobster fishing operation with 20 boats, like you don't necessarily have the muscle to implement DLP, or you don't even need it. Like, if you just fix the back door in your large suburban house, you don't need internal cameras. You don't need other factors, right? That's the analogy that I was going back to. And it's to essentially be context aware and to consider likelihood, exposure, and business impact, and then you recalculate the risk. So what is the risk is, I guess, what you want to ask. Well, of course, I can't give you the answer because we don't know. So this is a hypothetical scenario, but it's going to be less than high risk. So so when you go through an exercise like this, if you take each individual element on its own, it does look like it's high risk. Abuse of elevation control, oh my God, high risk. Able to transfer data to a cloud, oh, high risk. But when you look at the whole picture, like, are you evaluating a nuclear code facility or a suburban house? It matters, because when you go to a smaller organization, maybe it isn't a high risk. It's less than high. It'll be medium. Maybe it's low. Maybe it's not applicable even, because it's a very specific set of circumstances that you have to execute to get there. So I would argue that the high risk is only based on the point of entry. And then when you consider likelihood, exposure, you essentially recalculate the risk and you determine what the appropriate recommendations. Now, yes, in a large organization like a bank, of course, definitely, like, your prior high risk identifications will stand and your recommendations are spot on. But when it comes to small to medium enterprises that don't necessarily have the budget, I would definitely say that a more granular approach is useful. Yes, now I understand that what I've not addressed is, of course, there's a scope, there's a budget, and of course, you don't want to spend too much time on a small organization that may not essentially be paying as much. Those are up for debate, but like that is just, like I said, this is just merely a thought exercise, and that is basically all I have to say. So I guess how are we doing on time? Patrick, Steve, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. It's over?
Yes.
OK. So thank you, Rohan. Merci beaucoup. Est-ce qu'il y a je regarde les questions au niveau du chat. Je pense qu'il n'y a pas vraiment de questions. Donc, thank you, Rohan. Have a good day. And please just tell us your Discord ID so people can chat with you on the Discord channel if you're in.
Sure. Yeah. And now, of course, I'm also involved in the Tell Us Hackfest challenge. So yeah, I think my ID, I can just leave it in chat here for you.
Thank you.
Let me just go in. You can send it over.
Parfait. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde. La prochaine présentation est dans la track B, est à 11h25. Merci. Et à tantôt.